Poor Ogla-Moga. Section 3. Of many other of the deeds of Ogla-Moga, of how he imprisoned 3 estimable old ladies in the elevator, and before they were released had frightened them into hysterics, of how he at first took the milkman to be a brother Indian, and regularly for a time answered his morning howl with a terrifying war whoop, of how he kept the house in turmoil by ringing an electric bell wherever he could find one, in doing which he took a childish delight, there is no need to speak here. Happily for Miss Slotham, it so came about that Ogla-Moga was rescued from all his scrapes without the responsibility for him being traced to her, and without her secret being discovered, although many complaints poured into the office of the carelessness by which strange and dreadful men were allowed to get into the house, a subject, however, on which the landlord could never get any satisfactory information from Mr. Doherty. Happily for Miss Slotham again, the week of trial was almost ended. She had issued invitations to a reception for a Thursday evening, at which she caused it to be understood a paper would be read upon an important reform question. Many of her friends in the apartment house were included in the bidding to this feast of reason. The evening had arrived, and she was seated in her reception room, talking to the first comer, a very tall and grave gentleman with solemn long hair. This was Mr. Blagg, the well-known newspaper correspondent. He was a most ingenious and laborious writer. Having accumulated a certain amount of information, he wrote it out on Monday to a paper in the far west, and on Tuesday to another paper in the far east, varying the mixture somewhat, and on Wednesday varying it again to a paper in the north, and on Thursday to a paper in the south, giving the kaleidoscope of gossip still another shake. If it be true that a stamp of the foot displaces every atom of the globe, and that a word, once spoken, never ceases to reverberate through the universe, the intellectual atmosphere must have been disorganized with the clash and confusion of Mr. Blagg's contributions to contemporary history. But Mr. Blagg was also a general literary workman. He took contracts to write articles, pamphlets, and books, as a lawyer takes cases, not on their merits, but for the fee. If it must be admitted, he had written Miss Slotham's paper on the wrongs of the Indian, for a pecuniary compensation, for that lady was far from being a literary person. "Oh, it is so strong, Mr. Blagg," she was saying, "so noble, and the array of facts is so overwhelming. Where did you get them? Oh, what a power your pen is. Such as it is, Miss Slotham, it is always at your service," and Mr. Blagg closed his eyes in a faint ecstasy. Unlike literary persons as a class, he was not reluctant to be openly appreciated. As for the facts, he continued, they were easily secured. I had occasion to write another article on the Indian question, taking an exactly opposite view, and I found that many of the facts, in the hands of a skillful artist, could be used in both articles. I have often found that plan beneficial. It economizes labor, gives exercise to all the intellectual faculties, and, where one can secure orders for a brace of documents to contradict each other, is, I may say, and here Mr. Blagg coughed a little cough, pleasant to the pocket. But I want your help still further, dear Mr. Blagg. We must make this poor Indian's cause our own. We must agitate the matter. I hope that when this paper has been read tonight, and Miss Slotham looked down at the roll in her lap, you will be willing to write something about it to your papers. I want the influence of your pen to rouse the country. I'll do what my pen enables me to do, Miss Slotham, and I will say that I think it is not without its effect, replied Mr. Blagg, with the conscious pride of a man who knew that public opinion would never get itself properly molded without his help. It will be painful for us, of course, to be involved in anything like notoriety, but, and now a shade of lofty resignation passed over the lady's face, we must bear it for the sake of the cause. Miss Slotham already called it the cause. But the company had begun to assemble. Mr. Mixed was there, having deprived the ethical circle of the benefit of his ministrations for an entire week in order to be present. Mr. and Mrs. Eyre were there, with Miss Josephine and her lover, who was heard to remark that this would be great larks to tell the boys. The Misses Pound were also there, conveying in their looks their profound pity for a young man so sadly ensnared. Mrs. Gotham was there, with her pretty niece, who looked, as really pretty girls always do, prettier than ever. Professor File was there, and Mrs. Blenkin. But Lieutenant Ray had not been able to accept Miss Slotham's invitation. There were besides a considerable number of persons of limited celebrity, most of them fierce hobby riders, who, instead of leaving those unruly animals at home in their luxurious stalls, or outside of their friends' houses, as the instinct of politeness might have suggested, rode them boldly into the parlors of the best society, and ran them at full gallop into the midst of any conversation, so that often no sound could be heard but the noise of their hoofs. Of the number and kind of these hobbies there is no need here to speak, but when there were so many gathered into a single place, the neighing and snorting, the champing of conversational bits, and the pounding of huge and heavy feet were curious to behold and to hear. And Ogla-Moga? Now the native costumes were coming into play, and Miss Slotham's long martyrdom was to have its reward. She had conveyed to the Indian her desire that he should discard the garments of civilization, and array himself in those of his pristine barbarity. Remembering also that an Indian toilet is not complete without a good deal of decorative art, she lent him a collection of artists' materials kept for purposes of aesthetic display, and explained to him how to use them. The result was that when he emerged he was a sight to strike terror into any heart. His robes became him fiercely, and the blazonry of his colors even frightened her a little. She began to wonder whether, after all, Indian reform might not be a dangerous pursuit. But all this was accomplished, in her haste, 3 hours before the time of the reception. What was to be done with him in the meantime? He must needs sit and wait, like the ladies in the olden time who on the occasion of some great fete were obliged, through the multiplicity of the hairdresser's engagements, to pass under his hands early in the morning, perhaps, and then to sit like statues all day lest the lofty and beautiful structure on their heads should tumble into ruins. But how restrain him, this untutored Kickapoo? In her desperation a wild and wonderful scheme occurred to her. He had become savagely fond of raspberry jam. She would offer him a bribe of an unlimited quantity of this delicacy to go into some room and stay there, and once there, she would quietly lock the door. She canvassed in her mind all the rooms in her little box of a home. There was one, convenient, appropriate, and secure, the store-room. No sooner said than done. To see this fierce-looking Kickapoo clad in robes of savagery, and gleaming in all the paint of the war path, seated on Miss Slotham's refrigerator, and looking about on either side with barbaric curiosity at her array of shelves of jars and bottles, while he ate raspberry jam out of a rare and elegant saucer with an exquisite silver spoon, might have seemed a ludicrous spectacle to anybody less austere than Miss Slotham. But she only gave a sigh of relief, and softly turned the key, and went away to prepare for her guests. Ogla-Moga did not miss her. He finished the saucer of jam, and finished the jar, and then began explorations. He found various relishes, condiments, and preserves, and what not, all of which he tasted, some of which he enjoyed, and some of which he seemed to objurgate in choice Kickapoo. At last, for his terrific figure was now erect on the refrigerator, he saw something that sent a gleam of joy across his fiery face. It was a dark bottle that bore an inscription which he could not read, "Sop brandy." But there is one sense which needs no education. He pulled out the cork and put the mouth of the bottle to his nostrils, then he smiled grimly, and straightway sat down on the refrigerator. The time had arrived for Miss Slotham to read her paper. Mr. Mixed claimed the attention of the company by tapping on a table with a paper knife. "Ladies and gentlemen," said he, "we have come here dis evening as Drew philosophers, not for our own selfish pleasure entièrely, but, Mr. Margent looked uneasy, and fidgeted in his chair, in order to help in the solution of one of the great questions of the day, the Indian question. I have met some of desse obrest and downtrodden beoble. I know how amiable, how excellent, they are, like little children they have listened to me when I have talked to dem of de aura of Schrellenbach and de Versol, all wunder, and, I know, all belief. But I will not take down de time. My young and beautiful friend, Miss Slothan, the good, loyal man was sadly nearsighted, will read to you, and I believe she will have some terrible things to say. Terrible things indeed. Miss Slotham's manuscript ran with gore, the gore of the red man always. Massacres, surprises, and butcheries, in which the white man had slaked, only to renew it, his notorious thirst for Indian blood, followed each other across the pages of the paper, leaving each a darkening trail behind. The government of these United States, which, in the inconsistent, uncontinuous, and often bungling way of all governments, has probably tried to do its duty by the Indian, often succeeding only in making its benevolence a source of pauperism, and often betrayed by unfaithful officials and corrupt citizens into shameful acts of bad faith, was portrayed as a huge ogre, a giant blunderbore, drinking Indian blood from 2-quart bowls, and never breakfasting but on Indian baby. Meantime there filed through Miss Slotham's flowing sentences, like a procession of children with banners, the mild and faithful Modoc, the unsophisticated Sioux, the exemplary Paiute, the large-eyed and pensive Potawatomi, the polished Nez Perce, the amiable Pawnee, the meek and unobtrusive Ogallala, and the playful Apache. If there ever had been a massacre by Indians, or an act of savage cruelty by other than white men, it was not found necessary for the purposes of this paper to mention it. Perhaps emphasis is indispensable in advocating reforms, and Indian reforms are surely needed. At all events, there was no lack of accentuation in Miss Slotham's paper. The little audience murmured to each other of its literary skill, and noticed that Mr. Blagg, who was a high authority, wore an approving smile. And now, she read, as she approached the end of the essay, we have felt that there could be no better way to enlist the sympathies of practical men and women than to show them one of these unfortunate people as he is at home, in his native dress, in the picturesque pigments which he delights, in his innocent and childlike fancy, to adorn himself with, and to let you see how far he is from being the wretch he is represented to be, how clearly the natural mildness of his disposition, when unvexed by the tyranny of governments, shines through the manly beauty of his countenance. It has so happened that one of these poor creatures has been placed for a time under my charge, and here a look of dawning suspicion began to appear simultaneously upon the faces of Miss Eyre and Miss Tristan, and I shall be able to summon him in a few moments into your presence, and beg you to render, in behalf of this simple and suffering race, the kind yet impartial testimony of your own eyes. I ask this because, but what was this strange noise in the distance that made Miss Slotham pause in her reading, and sent a pallor across her cheek, a sound as of the dragging of a heavy body through the private hallway leading from her kitchen, a sound as of a struggle, and of scuffling and heavy breathing, and loud mutterings. It flashed upon her in an instant that she had forgotten the little window in the storeroom. Had Ogla-Moga escaped? What had happened? But she made an effort and resumed, I ask this because, mither of Moses. What are ye a-doin'? Let go me hair, or I'll scrame for the perlice, and forthwith there went up just outside of the drawing-room door a scream in the unmistakable voice of Bridget, which must have reached the traditionally absent policeman, no matter how far he was away. The company had now started to their feet in astonishment and fright. Quelt's coat step Eucalistini, or that was what the response sounded like. Another scream from Bridget. Akushnapakadema peshakwinishkrekepa. In another instant an extraordinary group reeled into the doorway, Ogla-Moga, with his robes torn and spattered, his paint smeared out of its original lines and colors, and his face furrowed with scratches inflicted by the hands of Bridget, Ogla-Moga drunk, utterly drunk, and brandishing in the air a glittering carving knife, and Bridget, alas, drunk too, with her hair in the firm grasp of the Indian, who was pulling her along. There was a universal shriek of horror. 3 of the ladies bolted through the only door which the Indian did not occupy, and which opened into a small bedroom. They frantically pulled it shut, just as 3 other ladies seized the knob on the outside and tried to pull it open. As luck would have it, Miss Eyre and her mother and Mrs. Blenkin were on the inside, and the 2 Misses Pound were on the outside, a fact which did not seem to diminish the natural anxiety of the ladies on either side of the door for their personal safety. At all events, the tug-of-war went on. Mr. Blagg showed extreme terror, and being plainly reduced by the same to a state of utter intellectual confusion and imbecility, made an insane attempt to scale the heights of a large what-not in the corner of the room, which, of course, promptly came over with him, hurling him to the floor with great violence, and falling directly upon him, while it covered his body and the larger part of the floor with the fragments of unprecedented teapots and alleged salad bowls. Mrs. Gotham and her niece barricaded themselves in the corner with a sofa, and armed themselves with huge photograph albums to be hurled at the enemy, while Professor File, who was a prominent member of the Peace Society, quietly stepped into the window recess, and drew the curtains in defense of his person and his principles. In the midst of the turmoil and dismay, Miss Tristan was heard to exclaim, "Oh, Auntie, it is Signor Barbazzo," and her aunt was heard to reply, with singular feeling, "Hold your tongue, child, and never speak to me again as long as you live." There was a marked rustle of the curtains in front of Professor File at this episode. Meantime Mr. Mixed, with a blind idea of doing something, without knowing in the least what it ought to be, had confronted the Indian, who still stood there muttering and shaking his knife. Just then he gave a terrible tug at Bridget's hair, that imparted a projectile motion to her as he swung her away from him. Her lowered head struck Mr. Mixed with full force in the neighborhood of the diaphragm, and the 2 went down on the floor with a crash. Mr. Margent, the first to recover his presence of mind, stepped over the extended toes of Miss Slotham, who had simply dropped into a chair in a dead faint, firmly seized the Indian's right hand, in which the knife was held, and putting his other hand on the Indian's shoulder, gently and easily tripped him up, and when he had got him down sat on his prostrate form. It had hardly been done when a dark little man slipped into the room, cast a swift glance around, and without stopping to look his astonishment, in a flash locked a pair of handcuffs on Ogla-Moga's wrists. In the hall outside was a vision of 2 policemen. Mr. Margent, without betraying the least surprise, slowly got up, pulled a toothpick out of his pocket, and began to use it, while he looked down upon the Indian. "What's he done?" he asked, coolly. "Oh, all sorts of things, killed a missionary, poured a can of kerosene on his squaw, and tried to set her on fire, because he wanted to take another one, and so on. The worst kickapoo of the lot. I've had hard work to find him, but, with a grin, I never expected to find him in a place like this." Ogla-Moga had fallen asleep then and there. The harsh music of his snore filled the room. To several persons present it had a familiar sound. Professor File, who had stuck his head out of the curtains, drew it in again suddenly, like the timid turtle. "Poor Ogla-Moga," said Miss Slotham, who had recovered, and had been listening. "What else could be expected under a cruel and despotic government? Ogla-Moga? Yes, ma'am, that's his name among the tribe. I'm the agent's deputy. We called him Ugly Mug, and that was the way the Indians pronounced it. It is ugly, you see, ma'am. It was ugly. It was the last blow." Miss Slotham said not another word, and, strange to say, Mr. Blagg never mentioned these interesting incidents in his correspondence.